Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. If you develop ideas in isolation, the answers you find to problems might be unusual and unorthodox. They could even be tinged with a certain genius. Australia has the koala and the kangaroo, for instance, animals which wouldn't exist if the continent was still bolted onto Southeast Asia. Leonardo da Vinci can make a convincing claim to have invented the helicopter and parachute whilst working alone in his Florentine workshop. But the closest that contemporary aviation comes to this might be the Swedish fighters that were developed during the 1940s. Sweden had found itself isolated from the outside world in a matter of months. There had been a lull after the invasion and dismembering of Poland in September 1939 that led people to talk of a phony war. But the phony war turned into something much more real in early 1940, when Nazi Germany first seized Denmark within hours and then staked its claim to Norway. The Germans would later form an alliance of expediency with Finland to fight Soviet Russia, and so, for the Swedes, it meant their country was first partially and then completely surrounded by hostile warring nations. They discreetly helped Finland with a whole unit of Swedish pilots in their Gloucester Gladiators known as F-13 flying in the Winter War. They allowed German troops to pass through the country and sold ball bearings to the Allies, so Swedish neutrality must have looked very, very fragile to Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson's government. There is no place in the thoughts of our people for aggression against any other country, Hansson said before the war started. And, just in case the Germans were listening, he also added that the strengthening of our defense preparations serves merely to underline our fixed determination to keep our country outside the conflicts that may erupt amongst others, and, during such conflicts, to safeguard the existence of our people. In the air at least, his defense preparations would soon look slightly threadbare. The domestic aviation industry was heavily reliant on imported airframes and engines, but the British now had their own priorities. The Americans placed an embargo in late 1940 on all exports of defense equipment to anyone other than the British. The Germans needed all their aircraft for what was becoming a multi-front war, but the Italians seemed quite happy to do deals. This looked positive, at least on paper. While they would sell aircraft to Sweden, the aircraft themselves weren't exactly what the Swedes wanted. Just over 70 examples of the Fiat CR42 flew with the Flygvapnet, of which 30 airframes were lost due to mechanical failures and accidents because of the low-quality materials used in their construction. A huge thanks to Variable Static Audio for sponsoring this video. Variable Static Audio is a startup company based in Texas that produces in-house designed and assembled headphones. Built with a focus on comfort and repairability, the sound is also genuinely very good, and they were kind enough to send a unit over for me to test myself. Aside from the very detailed and wide soundstage, VSA is an antithesis to the anti-consumerism that's rampant in consumer technology today. Not only are the headphones assembled using zero glue, only screws for maximum repairability, but Ryan, the guy running the company, has detailed instructions on his website on how to take apart and replace components if you so wish. And because all the parts are 3D printable, if anything goes wrong, which it has to be said is unlikely considering how incredibly durable they feel, Ryan will either send out a replacement part or send you the files for you to print it yourself if you have a 3D printer. The zero repairability that big companies seem to endorse now has never sat right with me, so I'm really happy that VSA has sponsored today's video, as not only are their headphones genuinely excellent products, but they have customer support and repairability that I've never seen the likes of before. They sent me a prototype headset of a new design they're working on, but I'm told apart from the smaller details and cosmetic changes, it'll be indicative of the final production model, and they've quickly become my favorite pair of headphones. And if all that wasn't enough, I recorded this entire segment with the inbuilt headset microphone, which is incredibly crisp and high quality for a mic of its class. Head to the link in the description or pinned comment to check out their website to have a look at their range of headphones. Now, back to the video. Some units operated them in Luleå and Kiruna, both in the far north of Sweden, where open cockpits that were ideal in the Mediterranean were now something of a liability. The Reggiana RE2000 were more solidly built, and 60 airframes gave loyal service to the Flygvapnet, at least for the period of time when these unreliable aircraft were not undergoing maintenance in their hangars. This left the Swedes with a choice. They could continue using obsolete aircraft that had been designed for more temperate climates, and hope that these would deter an aggressor armed with the latest Messerschmitt Me-109s and Fokker 190s, or start to build up the domestic aircraft industry. Unsurprisingly, they chose the latter. Back in 1939, with the war just 3 days old, Saab presented Project L12 to the Ministry of Defense at their base in Linköping. It would have a Bristol Taurus radial developing over 1,000 horsepower, 4 13.2mm wing-mounted cannons, and 2 8mm machine guns firing through the propeller, and a retractable undercarriage. It also strongly resembled a Mitsubishi Zero. With deliveries of all engines, including the Taurus and other equipment from Britain on permanent hold, Project L12, the Swedish Zero, was ended on the drawing board, and attention would shift to a new economy fighter that would eventually become the J-22. Sweden's main aircraft builder was Saab, already overtaxed by the demands that the war was placing on it, which meant that the J-22 would have to be built by FFVS, a specially created company that was intended to soak up some of this pressure. Some work had also started on Project L13, which was already taking an unconventional shape, with its armament in the front and engine in the rear. But rear-mounted radial engines present designers with cooling problems, unless they happen to be the Nomuro 9J rotary engine of the Airco DH2, which whirled behind the pilot, didn't need a cowling, and propelled the aircraft at a genteel 93 miles an hour. The cooling problems seemed to be impossible to solve, so Saab moved on from the failed L12 and L13 fighter projects and started creating the B-17, a single-engine dive bomber, and the B-18, a twin-engine bomber that looked like a Nordic version of the Junkers Ju-88. Both the B-17 and B-18 would use a wide range of power plants during their lives, reflecting the struggles that Sweden had in finding a reliable source of high-quality engines. Domestic engine makers Svenska Flygmotor were illegally producing the Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engine without a license, but many of these were earmarked for the J-22 fighter, and there were still doubts that there would be enough engines to meet the need of the aircraft due to roll off the production line. But there was a realization that the FFVS-built J-22 was, at best, a stopgap measure built with economy in mind. It relied on wooden construction to conserve vital materials, and its Pratt & Whitney engine would not have been anyone's first choice. It was rapidly aging, and meant that the airframe had to be designed to minimize weight in order to wring as much performance as possible out of its 12 cylinders. For all these were ingenious workarounds, they were not going to result in a world-beating fighter. Even if the L12 project had not come to an end, technology was evolving quickly in Europe, and it was clear that the frontline wings were going to need a fighter without the limitations of the J-22, if the Flygvapnet was to play a part in creating anything that looked like a credible deterrent. Fortunately for the Swedes, discussions had been taking place for years about license-building Daimler-Benz aero engines. The DB601 had been looked at, but the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, the body responsible for aviation in Nazi Germany, had stipulated that the Swedes would have to send them 100 engines a month in addition to the ones that they built for themselves. The Swedes gave up, but it later became clear that the later DB605 might be available instead. This coincided well with developments that had already been taking place within Saab. In April 1941, a group of government officials and pilots came to Linköping to see what had happened to the L13 project in the hands of designer Frid Ranström. The original design was unusual, but this must have been far more unorthodox than any of them were expecting. At the center of the design was a pusher propeller, housed along with the pilot in a central nacelle. The wings were attached to the central nacelle, each with a single boom stretching backwards and housing the landing gear and tail assembly. The third component of the landing gear was a long, thin undercarriage leg in the nose, giving the fighter a tricycle assembly of the kind which has not been seen in Europe for years. The new aircraft looked a lot like the love child of the Dornier Pfeil Do-335 and de Havilland Vampire, albeit about 3 years early, and possessed one significant advantage over other fighters in its class. All of the armament could be mounted in the nose, which would allow the aircraft to pack a hefty punch. More importantly, it had been decided that the problems with the radial engine were impossible to solve. Without the cooling blast of the slipstream, it now seemed to be wholly unworkable, so L-13 would have an inline engine, perhaps one in the Daimler-Benz family, since this also promised the same performance they were getting now from the pirated Pratt & Whitney in the J22, and possibly a bit extra. The DB601 had over 1,000 horsepower, but other developments promised double this. The government officials quickly wrote a check for 68,500 Swedish kronor, or about $300,000 in today's money, for further work on the project and for wind tunnel testing. There are rumors that the Swedes were having cautious conversations about license building the Messerschmitt Me-109 in the background of all this work, but the L-13 was given the cautious of approval of an official designation. The project was renumbered as L-21 and slowly started moving forwards. Perhaps unnerved by what Vanstrom was suggesting, Saab simultaneously decided to cover their bases by designing the L-23, a much more conventional fighter, similar to what was already being used in air battles across Western Europe. Although it only exists as design drawings, the L-23 was to look like a hybrid of the North American P-51B and Messerschmitt Me-109, with its razorback, an inverted V piston engine almost certainly from Daimler-Benz, and a large air scoop under the fuselage. The plans called for it to be armed with an engine-mounted 20mm cannon and to have four 13.2mm cannons in the wings. And to give the Swedish officials their due, the L-23 looks like a much safer bet than what Frid Vanstrom was suggesting. On October 22, 1941, the L-21 was cancelled in favour of this new fighter. And then the Swedes changed their minds, for reasons which are not wholly clear. On December 5, 1941, L-23 was surprisingly cancelled and L-21 got the go-ahead, but still proceeded very, very cautiously. There was wind tunnel testing at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and at the newly founded National Aeronautical Research Institute with 1 to 10 scale models and then with a half-size version. As well as a massive wind tunnel data, KTH also contributed to the story of the J-21 in a different way when their satirical magazine Blandaren referred to it as Saab's bullseye with 2 booms. In concert with his wind tunnel testing, an immense amount of mathematics suggested that the aircraft should have a laminar flow wing. This was an easy fix, but there was now the problem of what to do with its tricycle landing gear. This had to be strong enough to take the weight of the aircraft, which would end up weighing just over 4,000 kilograms, similar to a P-51 Mustang, but also long enough to give the propeller the necessary ground clearance while retracting neatly away. It was decided to place this in the 2 booms, much like a Lockheed P-38, which gives the wings its distinctive broken dart shape. Wind tunnel testing also resulted in changes to the vertical control surfaces, but it could not quite solve the problem on how to cool the engine. By the time the aircraft was ready for its first flight, this engine was the Daimler-Benz DB605. Just over 70 had been delivered to the Swedes that year, but they fell far short of the build quality they might have been expecting. Either due to sabotage by the slave workers who were building them, or the effects of Allied bombing, the engines were flawed, unreliable, and almost unusable. All of the production examples of the aircraft would have license-built versions of the DB605, to which thousands of changes had to be made by Swedish engineers, and 800 would later come out of Swedish factories. In fact, it would also serve in the B and T versions of the B-18 bomber. But for the time being, the imported ones would have to be made to work. Air intakes and oil coolers were built into the wing leading edge and worked once the L-21 was airborne, but did nothing when it was idling on the ground. 2 fans had to be installed to keep air moving over the cooling system, but it remained a problem for the aircraft's service life, and its safest bet was to have the ground crew standing by to keep the aircraft cool by spraying them with fire extinguishers. When one schoolboy saw an early version on the ground during a trip to a Swedish airbase, he asked what it was. He was sarcastically told by a pilot that the mystery aircraft was a new form of water dispenser. There was one final problem to solve. Conventional fighters are comparatively easy to get out of. The pilot opens the canopy and either jumps out or turns the aircraft upside down and falls out. In pusher aircraft, the propeller makes this difficult, if not impossible. When the aircraft also has a horizontal tailplane connecting the vertical tail surfaces, it meant that even if the engine had stopped, the tailplane would likely club the pilot unconscious. The Swedes considered blowing the propeller off with explosives or using a giant crutch mechanism to lever the pilot out of the aircraft, but the Germans had already offered a solution to this problem. The Heinkel HE-248 was an embryonic jet fighter whose potential speed would have been fatal to any pilot who needed to bail out. This made Heinkel experiment with different types of Schleudersitzapparat, literally ejection seat device, and the company trialed them in test situations before Helmut Schenk entered history on 13th of January 1942 by ejecting from the aircraft using a compressed air seat when his control surfaces iced up. Around 60 Luftwaffe pilots used variations of this seat late in the war. The Swedes patented a version of the compressed air seat in October 17, 1941, and trialed it first on a horizontal track, and then tested it vertically before installing a working version in a license-built Junkers Ju-86, where an 80-kilogram test dummy was catapulted 4 meters over its tailplane. The tests had been a success, but problems with making sure the seals were intact so that the compressed air would work properly meant that alternatives were needed. A.B. Bofors started working with Saab on a gunpowder-based seat from March 1943, with the working version finally referred to as the Mark I. Meanwhile, 2 prototypes were made of L-21. One of the prototypes, number 21001, was scheduled to make the first flight and did so with its Mark I ejection seat duly installed on the 30th of July 1943. It was flown by Chief Test Pilot Clay Smith, who had also flown the B-17 and would go on to fly the Saab Scandia airliner, promoting it around the world to such varied dignitaries as Haile Selassie and Howard Hughes. But everything did not go according to plan this time round. The Graz airfield at Linköping was not designed for advanced fighter aircraft, so Smith was advised by engineers to select full flaps before opening throttle to its fullest extent. He did so, and the L-21 tore across the airfield, but stubbornly refused to get airborne before colliding with a fence at the end of the runway. The L-21 was carefully disentangled from the fence and repositioned for takeoff, but not before Smith, who had been following the engineer's orders, was paradoxically told off for using full flaps. He duly tried again, and this time the L-21 got airborne easily and completed its first flight before completing its first landing. Seconds later, it also had its first crash. Unknown to Smith or anyone else present at the test flight, crashing into the fence had severed the hydraulic lines to the brakes, which meant that it refused to slow down. As it sped to the end of the runway, Smith fired the anti-spin parachute to halt its progress, but the sudden jolt caused the gear to collapse, and L-21 plowed along the airfield and skidded to an undignified halt on its belly. Fortunately, the aircraft had only suffered minor damage and could be repaired with relative ease, although it was decided to move it to the base used by F-7 Wing at Sathnas, where the resident pilots were flying lumbering Caproni CA-133 bombers, known in Sweden as B-16s. The B-16's greatest achievement was to kill over 40 of their crewmen in 23 fatal accidents, and to get 3 shot down by German fighters. The aircraft was transferred there, albeit not under its own power. In a further indignity, it was carried down to the Gotha Canal on board ship as deck cargo. Flight testing continued, but it was plagued by difficulties. Problems with the control surfaces when the aircraft entered a dive caused such severe buffeting that the canopy came loose and partially dislodged the landing gear, forcing Smith to make a hasty landing and causing the engineers to revisit their design. Smith would not be with the project much longer after an accident with a B-18 left him in hospital, so flying duties were passed over to Anders Helgstrand. Helgstrand would not have much more luck. At the start of March 1944, the gear jammed and then broke, pitching the L-21 nose onto the runway, and another gear failure happened the next month. Attention shifted to the second test aircraft, number 21002, which finally graduated to service trials with F-8 wing on the 24th of February 1945. Since F-8 were operating the Seversky P-35s, having previously flown the Gloucester Gladiator, the aircraft must have looked like something out of a science fiction novel. By now, it had received the official designation J-21, since J refers to Jakt in Swedish, which translates as hunter, and the first order had been made in 1943 for 54 aircraft. They were delivered as J-21A1s on the 1st of December 1945. The aircraft could now pack a heavy punch, with one 20mm cannon and two 13.2mm machine guns in the nose, and also two machine guns in each boom. F-8 wing were the first to get these aircraft, with other units following suit, including F-9 wing near Gothenburg, but production soon ceased on the 5th of December 1946 in favor of the improved J-21A2, which went straight to F-15 wing in Söderhamn. It soon became clear that the J-21 was not destined for a long career. While pilots said it was pleasant to fly, had good stall characteristics, and a particularly tight turning circle, it was also heavy on the controls, which would have made prolonged dogfighting difficult and dangerous, since rear visibility was almost non-existent. The J-21 was not a world beater, and the Flygvapnet were distinctly underwhelmed with their new toy. Worse news for the J-21 was that the Swedes had signed a contract in February 1945 for 50 P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang was a more capable fighter than the J-21 would ever be, no matter how many versions it went through, and came through with a much better radio. Known as the J-26 in Swedish service, 43 P-51s were flown from Liverpool to Bromma Airport in Stockholm, but not before one Messerschmitt Me-109 had been shot down on the ferry flight, further advertising its combat credentials. A second contract was signed for 90 more aircraft in 1946, with these being flown over from US depots in Germany via Bremen to Sathernäs in Sweden, and a final batch of 21 followed, starting in 1948, with the last one being taken into Swedish service in March 1950. The steady flow of combat-proven fighters meant that the initial order for 484 J-21s was now starting to look optimistic in the extreme, and only 298 were delivered by the time production ended at Saab's Trollhättan factory in November 1948. In the meantime, the J-21A2 was given a different 20mm cannon in its nose, this time made by Bofors instead of Hispano-Suiza, and with 140 rounds instead of the previous 60, with upgrades to its avionics, including an improved sighting system. It was clear, however, that no amount of tweaks would make the J-21 any better as a fighter, and a further blow came in June 1946 when the Swedes started to acquire its first batch of de Havilland Vampire aircraft, dubbed the J-28. This was equipped with 4 20mm cannons, and with a top speed of around 540 miles an hour, it was a full 140 miles an hour faster than the J-21. There were now 2 superior fighters in Sweden, with the result that the J-21A3 variant was introduced as a ground attacker. There were 119 of these delivered between May 1947 and January 1949, with storage pylons underneath the main nacelle, under the inner and outer wings, as well as the wingtips for a dizzying array of bombs and rockets, allowing strikes on everything from armor to ships and personnel. An extra sight was added so that the J-21 could deliver the new ordnance, and finally, it seemed to have found its niche. It was a solid, unspectacular fighter, but in the ground attack role it proved to be a stable, devastating gun platform that was sturdy and solid enough to deliver its weapons onto targets with reasonable accuracy. It served with a number of wings, including F-6 in Karlsborg, F-7 in Sathernäs, F-12 in Kalmar, and F-15 in Söderhamn. A J-21 pilot remembered, "I have dropped 4 bombs in my entire flying life, and it was with this type of aircraft. It was much more difficult than I had imagined. The first bomb was a real miss, so I had to sharpen up both flying and preparation properly. The other 3 were reasonably successful, but I still didn't get a full hit." There was one memorable footnote to the J-21's career. On the 29th of July 1946, a J-21 flown by Bengt Johansson of F-9 wing collided with a J-22, also of F-9 wing, during naval gunnery practice. The J-21 was hit by a J-22 during a pass, taking off one of its twin tailplanes and rendering it uncontrollable. The J-22 pilot parachuted to safety, and Johansson jettisoned his canopy and ejected, thereby saving his life in the process. Both men were rescued by a Swedish destroyer. The J-21 completed its journey into retirement in 1954, but there was going to be a lengthy postscript courtesy of de Havilland in the UK. The pusher configuration of the J-21 meant that it seemed to lend itself to being fitted with one of the new jet engines that were being used by the British and Americans. A project to fit the J-21 with a Griffin engine came to nothing, but the de Havilland Goblin turbojet promised significant performance improvements and slightly less of a design and development dead end. 4 J-21A1s were taken off the production line in March 1946 and taken to Linköping, where the Daimler-Benz engines were to be replaced with the Goblin. The designers and engineers hoped that only 20% of the airframes would need to be changed, but in the event, the whole modifications needed to be much more extensive and 50% of the aircraft would be wholly new. The horizontal tailplane had to be raised to lift it out of the jet blast, and even the central nacelle had to be redesigned to fit in the new engine and the necessary air intakes. The wing was changed so that the leading edge was pulled forwards, and the canopy was given a redesign to make it more streamlined. What could not be designed away was the Goblin's thirst for fuel, which gave the new aircraft no more than 45 minutes in the air, not an ideal loiter time for a combat aircraft covering a country with a 3,000-kilometer coastline. It first flew at Bravalla on the 10th of March 1947, and it was soon found that the aircraft now behaved in some very alarming ways. As the J-21 approached its critical Mach number, the nose would drop and the airframe would start to experience buffeting associated with compressibility problems, which meant that it would need to be given air brakes in the trailing edges of the wings. A complete redesign of the wing was suggested, but costs were spiraling and the Vampire was already showing vastly superior performance. The new, heavily modified aircraft would enter service as the J-21R, with the R standing for Reaktionmotor in Swedish, or Jetenden in English. It should have been ordered in an initial batch of 120, but the disappointment was such that on March 24, 1947, only 60 aircraft were ordered, intended to equip F-10 wing based at Ängelholm. Delivery was begun in August 1949, where it proved to be as successful as a fighter as the J-21 had been, and was soon replaced by the Vampire. History repeated itself, and the solution proved to be that the J-21R would now be recast as a ground attack aircraft, redesignated as the A-21RA or A-21RB. The A variant would have British-built engines, and the B variant would have license-built Swedish versions. They could carry a forbidding row of 4.5 and 18cm ground attack rockets under the fuselage, or a Padan gun pod. Padan is Swedish for toad, and the plump little pod contained 8 8mm machine guns with 800 rounds each. Production ceased in January 1951, and the A-21s were the last of the type to be retired from frontline service, with F-7 wing in 1954. They continued to serve in the training role until the spring of 1957, and gave way to Vampires, the Saab J-29 Tunan and the A-32A Lansen. By then, the J-21's original designer, Frid Vanstrom, was very busy elsewhere. Vanstrom had travelled to Switzerland repeatedly in November 1945 and met with an unknown source who had secret blueprints of the Messerschmitt P-1101, P-1110, P-1111, and P-1112 aircraft, as well as information on the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Me-163 Comet. Rumour suggests that these plans had been saved on microfilm and packed in a watertight package by a Messerschmitt employee who was lucky not to be shot by the SS before making their way to Switzerland. Vanstrom's papers also included such subjects as the behaviour of arrow shapes at high speeds, investigations on propellers with arrow-shaped curved blade axes, but perhaps most interestingly of all, wind tunnel results for swept wings. This haul of information would help inspire the Saab J-21 Tunan, Europe's first post-war swept-wing fighter, which first flew on the 1st of September 1948, and which looks oddly like the Messerschmitt P-1101. Its influence is also evident in the Saab Lansen, which first flew on the 3rd of November 1952. There is another interesting addition to the story. One of the Saab's engineer's friends was a German mathematician, Hermann Behohm, who had worked for Messerschmitt and would officially join Saab in 1951 and take Swedish citizenship. He worked on an unbroken line of classic aircraft from the Lansen to the Saab Drachen, Saab Viggen, and Saab 105 trainer. But whether he had been helping Saab and Fred Vanstrom before then by being the mysterious source he met up in Switzerland may never be known. Talk of microfilm and mysterious meetings is all the more surprising since Vanstrom himself looks less like James Bond than a kindly tortoise, but through his secret activities in Switzerland, the man who came up with the design of the J-21 may well have had more impact on the Swedish aviation industry than anyone else in history. There were nearly 300 of his aircraft built over a 4-year period, and a further 60 examples of the J-21R. Despite this, and despite the aircraft standing at the crossroads of propeller and jet technology at a crucial moment in Swedish history, only 3 survive, and none in flying condition. One J-21A3 was rebuilt by volunteers to represent an A-21R, and is on display at the Swedish Air Force Museum in Linköping, where there is another J-21A3, this time in its original condition. A third J-21A3 can be found at the Söderhamn Flygmuseum. Its unusual appearance to one side, the J-21 might not have been a remarkable combat aircraft, and its performance might not have made good on the promise suggested by its futuristic looks, but its story is unusually interesting. The J-21 pioneered the practical use of the ejector seat, and gave both Swedish pilots and the domestic aviation industry the chance to start a gradual transition to the jet age. And by giving Fred Vanstrom an outlet for talents, as both a designer and as an agent in the war of industrial espionage, it transformed aircraft design forever. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.